My next guest is Bryson Tarbet. He is a pre-K through sixth grade general music teacher just outside of Columbus, Ohio. He received his Bachelor's of Music in Music Education from Ohio Wesleyan University and his Master's of Music in Music Education with a Kodály emphasis from Capital University. Bryson has spent the first year out of college as part of an elementary school intervention team and fell in love with working with students with disabilities. Due to this experience, as well as his personal experience as a neurodiverse individual, Bryson feels very strongly about advocating for sensory and emotionally inclusive classrooms. Bryson started That Music Teacher LLC with the goal of sharing different perspectives and issues pertaining to the lives of music educators across the country. He also hosts That Music Podcast, a podcast for elementary music teachers, and is the educator behind the Elementary Music Summit. And I'd like to also talk about the podcast in our recording today. But welcome to the podcast, Bryson. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to see what we can get into in today's conversation.
Great. Well, we'll start off with a question that I ask everybody, which is, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Oh, I have so many things that I could think of and so many great ways that I got out of the trenches. One that, comes to mind initially is when I was an undergrad, I really struggled with my mental health and really struggled with depression and anxiety. And unfortunately, it ended in a not so great situation that required me to take a big, huge step back and really re-examine a lot of different things. And it was really hard having to completely stop and essentially rebuild my life. But I'm so excited to be here. And I'm so glad that I've had so many different experiences because of that have led me to where my career and where my life is today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we talked a lot about in the bio the accessible classrooms and just in terms of a music teacher. First, tell me a little bit about how a music teacher can make their classrooms more accessible, and then how you speak to maybe a general education teacher on making just in terms of like a lot of the hands-on. I know you have a lot of like instruments and different things that kids like to touch in a music class.
I want to start by saying that any classroom can be accessible. When we say accessibility, we're not necessarily saying doing things that allow kids to be help, or changing the assignment or things like that. But when it comes down to the core of it is really removing barriers to access so that everyone that walks into your classroom can be successful. And for me, what that looks like in practice is being very precise and very particular about the way that my classroom is set up and the way that my lessons are set up, so that my students, for instance, my students that might have sensory conditions or sensory sensitivities, they're going to be able to have over-the-ear headphones, or they're going to be able to access some fidgets, things that we can implement that help all students access our curriculum in so many different ways. And then when it comes to, the general education classroom and how music and education in general works, I really think that it comes down to that when we think about it, we are not teaching science. We're not teaching music. We're not teaching math. What we're doing is teaching children. We just tend to have different ways of doing that. And I love music for so many different reasons, but educationally, what I see can happen and has happened so many times is that when we have students that are set up in a way where they're able to express themselves creatively and kind of think of things in a different way, we see those social emotional skills come out. We see those relationship skills come out. We see those connections to other art forms, to other subject areas. And when it comes down to it, regardless of what we teach, it really comes down to the students that are in our classroom and how we can get them on the easiest path, or not necessarily the easiest path, but the paths with the most thought into it, so that they can be successful.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into how to make a classroom also accessible if you're having students who have a lot of behavior issues, and this could be just general or if they're maybe not even diagnosed with ADHD, but they're just going maybe trauma-informed practices using that more. And then also if you have some students who are, inclusive classrooms, and we have students with severe significant needs, and, they might be making utterances throughout the lesson, things like that. How do we help them feel like a part of the classroom?
So there's so many good questions there, and because they're questions that are getting asked a lot,
Yeah,
and I'm glad they're getting asked because it
yeah,
kind of comes to that point. We're trying to do better.
yeah,
Unfortunately, part of the problem is they're being asked because a lot of people don't know the answers, or they feel like
yeah.
their answer that they've come up with isn't good enough. And when it kind of comes down to it, I found that when it comes to behaviors and classroom management, a lot of it goes down to when I'm able to ensure that my students can access the curriculum and that they're
Mhm.
able to do it in a way that sets them up for success. That's when they're going to want to do the right things. That's when they're going to be more able to control themselves because they're engaged. So what
Yeah.
are some things that we can do to increase engagement, to increase their sensory and emotional regulation? Some of the easiest things that I do in my classroom, like I've said before, I allow all of my students to use fidgets.
Mhm.
All of my students can always go over and grab a set of over-the-ear headphones to kind of, if it gets too loud. I only have half the lights on because I have these wonderful windows in my classroom. So if we just have all the fluorescent lights on anyway, it's just too bright. And doing it in a way that is also, when I'm creating and delivering my lessons, I'm not asking them to do things that really aren't able to do in a successful way.
Yeah.
For instance, I had kindergarten was the last class that I taught today. I love
Mhm.
kindergarten music, but it's a little bit like herding cats sometimes. And and I say that lovingly, but the reality is if I were to plan a lesson where I wanted them to sit crisscross applesauce for 27 minutes,
Yeah.
they're not going to do it. It's not going to be successful. I can yell at them
Yeah.
all I want. I can remind them of
Yeah.
expectations all I want. The reality is the students that we have in front of us are not fit by the way that I was teaching them. Now,
Yeah.
that's not how I taught them because I have gone through, I've really made sure that for instance, in my classroom, I don't want to be in one space doing the same thing for more than 7 minutes.
Sure.
I see my kids for 40 minutes. So, what can I do to cycle through every 7 minutes or so that we're in a different location? We're not sitting in front of the chalkboard. Now we're standing in a circle. What are
Yeah.
we able to do to kind of bookend their focus, to bring them back in, re engage them into the lesson? And I found that implementing those changes allows so much more of the students that I serve be successful because the behaviors that are that aren't necessarily coming on purpose, they're just impulses and things like that,
Right.
we're not seeing those as often because they're so engaged, because we're able to reset their focus and reset where they are and what they're supposed to do, rather than letting them sit there for the entire 40 minutes and do the same thing. And that's when our expectations differ from the reality of what kids can give us.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I like how you point out just, getting them to, switch places. I know I've subbed in elementary music some, and, having them do the circles and then having them sit on their spot and then having them maybe do some dance. And, it doesn't matter if they're in kindergarten or 3rd or 5th grade, but really switching it up a lot, like you said, and not always teaching from the same spot in the classroom, and not expecting the one kindergarten class is gonna be the same as the other one, right?
Yeah, I just released an episode on my podcast, that music podcast, this past week, all about what I call classroom zones. So
Uh-huh.
in my classroom, it's in front of the chalkboard, it's over in front of my little reading nook, it's making a circle, it's scattered, and the kids, we kind of implement these so that they get to know what these different spaces are.
Yeah,
And then another little added tip is if you're able to give them transitions, give them something to do while they're transitioning from zone to zone, that's
yeah,
when they're going to be so much easier. So for instance, one that I use a lot is I'll have my students like, all right, can you sing and clap the rhythm of the song while you move over to the reading nook or whatever? And it gives them
yeah,
something to do. It gives them a really short time frame because hey, by the end of the song, we got to be there. And it
yeah.
really allows the flow to go so that the students are engaged. And there really isn't time for us to get a lot of those let's say less than desirable behaviors.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I like that. It keeps them engaged. It keeps their mind on other things than just going off somewhere they shouldn't be in the
For sure.
classroom. So,
Physically
uh,
or mentally.
yeah, yeah. So, we talk a lot about play-based learning for younger kiddos, but when we're talking about the older elementary or even kids that are getting ready to go into middle school, how do you plan for purposeful play? You said you teach in both a K through 4 and then a 5 and 6 school. So definitely the planning will look different for the upper grades.
So like I said, I typically, well, let me take a step back. I love play-based learning. I think it is the way that kids learn best. It's so joyful. The kids want to be there. The engagement's high. And like we said before, getting all the engagement higher is super helpful for so many reasons. What that looks like from grade level to grade level can look differently. But I think when we really look at the foundations of it, it's giving the students the ingredients and kind of seeing what they can come up with.
Okay.
And depending on the grade level, depending on the class itself, you might give them more pieces of the recipe. I like to think of it kind of like the Great British Bake Off, which sometimes they just have a very basic recipe and it just says cook the bread. They're like, well, how long am I supposed to cook it?
Yeah.
Some students will be able to figure out their own solution to that. Some students will need a little bit, a little bit more persuading. And this can look at something as simple as composing or improvising on a xylophone, but it could also be as simple as saying, hey, I have this pile of instruments. How can we sort these in a way
Hmm.
that makes sense? So again, not only are we talking about classifying instruments into their families, but there's so many skills that go into classifying and categorizing and working together with other people to figure it out. And that the basis of play-based learning, for me at least, is the kids are experiencing the learning and the kids have
Hmm.
active agency in it. And that is going to, like you said, it's going to look very different from kindergarten to sixth grade. But when you look at what I'm asking them to do and what I'm giving them, it often looks very similar, just a different process along the way.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I like how you talk about like breaking it up and giving them some of the ingredients. For the younger grades, you might have to give more ingredients, right? But really, yeah, and looking at the different tasks like the sorting, the classifying. Also, when they start learning about instruments, like is this a wind instrument? Is this a string instrument? Things like that. So, yeah, and then it helps make it fun. So have you worked with teachers, maybe given some talks to great other teachers in just regular gen ed classrooms, and how could they make some more activities play based? Would you be able to give some tips on that?
So it really comes down
Yeah,
to how can we let the students take charge, honestly? How
yeah,
can we make it, I listen to a lot of different podcasts and sometimes they're like, well, what if it was easy? And I think, well, what if
yeah,
it was fun? How can we take this lesson and how can we make it look like if we just gave kids free reign and saw what happens? Think about things that happen on the playground. There's so much learning that's happening in the playground. You might have kids they just found this really cool bug and they're chasing everyone with it. And there's all these
yeah,
different things going on. But the reality is those kids are learning a lot of skills. These
yeah,
kids were able, I mean, whether or not they said, yes, this is what the category of this bug is, they're making observations. They're thinking about this, what is this bug? Is this a safe bug? Is this a bug that might scare Johnny if I chase him after it? So when we're thinking
mhm,
about
mhm,
play-based learning in our classroom, what can we do to allow it to be joyful and fun? So in a gen ed classroom, that could look something, could look very different depending on the age and the topic. But if you have a specific skill you want them to do, if you want them to be able to figure this out, if you want them to be able to, let's for instance, spell a word, what ways could you do this other than just saying, all right, write this word down? I know my kid, or when I was a kid, I loved the game Sparkle. It was a wonderful way to
mhm.
gamify the learning. We were still learning. There was some strategy involved because we had to pay attention, and what if it were fun? How can we
Yeah,
make this fun? And I know that sometimes there are things that we hate teaching that the powers that be say is something that
yeah,
we have to teach. So what can we do to flip it and say, all right, what can we do to make this fun? How can we make this joyful? And sometimes it goes down to saying, hey, kids, we just learned this concept. What do you think we should do next? What
mhm,
do you think we should do with this information? How can we do things like project-based learning and things like that? And it, really see where it goes. And I know that there are time constraints that can be very hindering when it comes to
yeah,
this type of learning. But what can we do as the teachers to relinquish a little bit of that control and
yeah,
let the kids be kids, but using the concepts we want them to be?
yeah. And I really like that piece about letting it be more student centered and student choice rather than just going off of what your lesson plan is or what your PLC's goals are, right? And I think there's a lot of teachers that can get more buy-in from kids when we're having them be a part of the decision, right? And not let that fall by the wayside, like you said, the gamification. We talked a lot about that when we were doing remote teaching, but I don't see that all the time, going on. There's bits and pieces, but I think we need to bring more of that back. Yeah. So I talked in your bio about sensory processing and how you growing up with a sensory processing disorder and ADHD, how that changed your approach to teaching when you became a teacher. And you told me that when you went to college, you did plan on being a music teacher. So how did you kind of develop the passion as you were going through K-12 as well?
It's been a journey to
Yeah.
get through school. And honestly, even to this day, I'll still realize different things that are what I call my neurospiciness.
Yeah.
Or like things I'm like, oh, that's not a normal thing to do. That's something that
Sure.
Bryson's brain figures out. And
Yeah.
going through school with ADHD and sensory processing disorder, and being in the arts, being in music where there is a lot of sensory input,
Yeah.
I've learned and had to unlearn some different ways that I kind of experienced life, and experienced things. And one thing that I wanted to really bring into my teaching was the understanding that sometimes a student truly has no control over moving their body.
Mm.
Sometimes a student is trying so hard to do what they need to do, so hard to focus, but they physically can't. And what can we do to help them be successful? And
Mhm.
one major switch that I've made in my language, once I started realizing and seeing these students and seeing myself in the students that were really struggling with, things like staying on task and, not being overstimulated and things like that, these classic signs of overstimulation. And instead of saying, I need you to sit down, or, hey, I need
Mhm.
you to stop yelling, taking them aside, getting, not bringing it nice and calm, and say, what can I do to help you? I see that you're struggling to focus, and that must be very frustrating. What can I do to help you? And I know that some teachers feel like, well, it shouldn't be on me. The
Yeah.
student needs to, they need to, suck it up and do it. And the reality is there are some kids that are taking advantage of a system, but there are so many kids that truly are trying their best, and they go through their day only hearing their name as a negative redirection. And that breaks my heart because that student is giving 120% to try to
Mhm.
focus. It's just the
Mhm.
results aren't getting there.
Mhm.
So making that shift in my language, I've seen such a difference in my students. Because for one, some of them will go, I don't know. I don't, what can you do?
Yeah.
And that really starts this process of allowing students to understand that sometimes they're going to need to advocate for themselves. And
Yeah.
sometimes they're going to need to come up with some solutions. And shifting that language so that it's a collaborative effort rather than me coming in from a place of authority has been a huge change in my teaching, and honestly just feels so right to me.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, and I really like how you pointed out, like, just changing your languaging, right? And not saying like something you need, but like, how can I offer help? Because kids are not going to refuse your help in most cases, right? And you're providing that as the teacher who supports them and understands that they might be in need of some help. And as I was asking about, like, in terms of your K-12 experience, was music just something that you grew up having a passion for? Did you play instruments and then decided that's what you wanted to be pretty early in life, or was it kind of as you went through high school that you got into that, like wanting to be a music teacher?
I have always been kind of the center of attention whenever I
Uh-huh.
could help it.
Okay.
I started doing community theater very young. I
Okay.
I transferred in fifth grade to an arts magnet school, which was awesome because I got to do band, choir, and orchestra starting in fifth grade, and that kind of really shaped me into the musician I am. Fast forward a little bit into high school, I was like, all right, I love singing. What's the next step? And I was so
Yeah.
close to going music performance,
Yeah.
and I'm like, I, I'm feeling really called this way. So I went into music
Yeah.
education, said, all right, I'm going to be this wonderful high school choir director. I'm going to take all the kids to competition. We're going to sing at Disney. It's going to be amazing. And then my first class in undergrad, we observed a high school classroom and I hated it. She was a
Okay.
wonderful teacher. There was nothing wrong with it. It just, I was like, this isn't for me. This isn't the life that I want. And I was heartbroken because I had literally just gotten there. I'd literally just
Yeah.
gotten to undergrad and I'm like, all right, guess I have to start over.
Yeah.
Thankfully, the next week or so, I was able to observe a second grade music classroom,
Yeah.
and it completely changed the trajectory of my life because I saw that joy that we were talking about earlier. I saw the ability for everyone to be a part of that class and for everyone to make music in the way that they are able to. And it completely changed the trajectory of my life, my career. And I'm so glad that things turned out the way they did.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's really interesting how like you had that like yeah, that you were thinking about like the competitions and Disney and all that probably for years based on your high school experience. But then, just seeing that observation, how the little kids learn music and developing the passion for helping them understand music. Yeah, it just takes that one little step, that one observation. So talk to me a little bit about your business, because you told me you haven't been in education for too long. I think you said 6 years.
Yeah.
Okay, and so it's not that often I hear from people who are relatively new to teaching have started their own business. So your business, that music teacher, and then the podcast, the music podcast. So what got you into launching your own business, and how does it serve elementary music teachers?
Well, to make a long story short, I spent my first year of undergrad outside of the music classroom working in the special ed world, and I loved it. It was such an amazing experience, but I missed the music classroom. So I created an Instagram account at that music teacher because I wanted to be able to follow a bunch of music teachers that were sharing what they were doing without clogging up my main feed. And that turned into when I started teaching, I would share what I was doing. My first year of teaching, I just accidentally went live on Instagram, didn't even know that was a thing that happened. And I just kind of went with it. It just started
Yeah.
sharing what I was doing. And that turned into this whole guest series on Instagram Live, which turned into the podcast. And it just keeps spiraling. And
Yeah.
the reason, one, I love doing it. It truly is my self-care to be able to help serve teachers in their classrooms from all over the world. But what I really noticed was there is such a lack in content specific professional development for elementary music teachers, especially at the school and district level. Even within the state, if you're, the state music conferences that can be hit or miss at the, if you're at the, Ohio Music Education Association's music conference, it might be a great conference, but there's like 3 different rooms that are out that general music is in, and the rest is like all the high school stuff. And I really realized that there was such a lack of quality PD out there that was accessible for teachers and the reality is there's so many elementary music teachers out there. And I hate being thought of as my purpose is to prepare kids for band and choir. But the reality is, whether or not they do band or choir, what happens in our classroom is oftentimes the most foundational, formal, at least, music education a student will receive. And whether or not they go on to make music formally after they leave my classroom, I want them to leave knowing that the arts are important and knowing that the arts are there for whenever they need them, because they can serve so many different purposes. And that is really at the core for me why I do what I do.
So on your website, how kind of what kind of PD can they find, or resources? Do you offer videos, blogs, articles, or maybe discussion points? Is there like a chat group? What can they find on your website?
I really like sharing like practical tips. Like, this is something that you can do in your classroom. This is something that, or this is an approach that you can use to make your classroom more accessible. One of my favorite things that I've ever done in my life was the Elementary Music Summit, which we hosted the first time this past summer, where we welcomed over 2,400 elementary music teachers to a free online professional development conference where they were able to really get tips and tricks from other teachers that were in the field who are doing what they're doing and know the reality of, especially, the last couple of years, a post-COVID music classroom. And being able to do that in a way to really give them the momentum to have their most successful school year yet is probably the highlight of my career. To be able to be a part of such an impactful event really made my teacher heart so full.
Do you have plans to put that on again this year, or?
We are. It's going to be bigger
Okay.
and better. It's going to be July 10th through the 14th, and I am so
Okay.
excited.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that information, and I will direct people to your website. Um, I would just have this great conversation about your just your background and how you teach, keeping in mind all learning styles and all needs, and you know, your own journey to become a music teacher. Out of everything we talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
Uh, Regardless of who you are, or what you do, or what you teach, or how you impact children's lives, remember that every single student is unique. They have experiences that you have lived, and they have experiences that you have not lived. And it comes down to ensuring that regardless of who they are or what baggage they come in with, is your classroom a place that they can be successful? That's the question I want you to ask yourself, and then take the steps to make sure the answer is always yes.
Where can people connect with you and find you online?
The best place to hang out with me is on, if you are a podcast listener, at That Music Podcast, or at That Music Teacher on Instagram.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. And I'm going to make sure, you know, people get information about the summit before it happens. I'll be releasing the episode close to the date that summit goes live, and so they'll know where to register and be a part of that. So thank you for all you do to providing PD for these elementary school music teachers.
Thank you so much for having me.